It's the Growing for Market podcast.
When you're trying to find a market for yourself as a farm, go outside the box. Don't necessarily just stick to the same models that a lot of folks do. When you do try and work with different businesses, relationships are really important. Organizations are really important. You really have to be providing the same level of customer service to your businesses you work with that a massive international produce distribution chain will provide in order to be competitive. And while that sounds daunting, it's not at the end of the day, because really that's just one sales rep for that company who's managing it. And you can do the same thing, but you do have to be really organized in order to do that, in order to be able to sell to those markets.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing vegetables and flowers for local markets like farmers markets, CSAs, farm stands, and local wholesaling. I'm Katie Kula, your host and a writer for Growing for Market magazine. For 32 years, the only magazine devoted solely to flower and vegetable market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. And now, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free.
Every fall on our farm, we order a couple sling bags of Fort V potting soil from Vermont Compost. Over the years, we've tried a lot of the compost and potting soil options out there, from making our own to buying off the shelf. And we keep coming back to Vermont Compost, both for overall quality and batch-to-batch consistency. It's that consistency that keeps us coming back. There are so many variables that affect how good your seedlings are. We know Vermont Compost will give our plants the best possible foundation, so we can stick to worrying about all the other stuff and not the potting soil. Visit vermontcompost.com/GFM for more details. Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or vegetables for your family, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment for a harvest you can count on. Rimmel greenhouses are strong, durable, and easy to assemble, offering the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Rimmel greenhouses are proudly built right here in America and shipped to anywhere in the U.S. With technical sales staff members located across the country, many with growing experience, the Rimmel Greenhouses team of experts will serve as your trusted partner every step of the way to ensure that you get exceptional value from your greenhouse investment. Visit rimmel.com to get a quote today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, I'm excited to talk with Cole Mazariegos-Anastassio. He and his wife, Veronica, are co-operators of Brisa Ranch, along with their friend Cristóbal Cruz Hernández. They started Brisa Ranch in 2018 and now grow about 40 different organic crops on 30 acres in Pescadero, California, which is about 45 miles from the Bay Area. They sell 90% of their produce directly to businesses and institutions throughout Northern California. In 2021, they were named California New Farmers of the Year by the Community Alliance with Family Farmers. So growing on 30 acres might seem like a bigger farm to a lot of our listening audience in many regions of the U.S., but by California standards, Brisa Ranch is still relatively small. So I'm excited to talk with Cole about how they got their foot in the door in what I understand to be a pretty packed existing California farming landscape and market, and how they've shaped their farm through their core values. So Cole, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome to the show.
No, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure being here.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. You started Brisa Ranch relatively recently in 2018, but all three of the founders have been involved in agriculture for much longer. So can you share a little bit about your path to where you are today, how, when, why you decided to start your own farm?
Yeah, definitely. I guess I can speak a little bit for all three members of our team. So it's as you mentioned, it's myself, Veronica, who's also my wife, and Cristóbal, our friend as well. I guess one by one, just to give a brief background, Cristóbal is from Oaxaca. He grew up in Oaxaca. He immigrated to the U.S. when he was 18. And actually, the first ranch, he already started working in agriculture, and the first ranch he started working at was actually the land that we currently farm today. So that was his first 3 years of living in the U.S. He farmed on this ranch. He then moved on to work at other ranches elsewhere, other farms. And eventually it's kind of a full circle thing for him to come back and have us lease land on this ranch. So that's kind of a neat full circle that he's had. And his family in Oaxaca has been kind of involved in agriculture for a long time. Veronica, her background is more for herself personally, and there's not as much background within her family. She grew up in Miami, Florida. Her parents are from Guatemala and Venezuela. And she grew up there, was not really interested in agriculture until after college. She did the Peace Corps in Togo in West Africa and was involved in some rice farming projects there and kind of caught the bug for agriculture. And over time, kind of grew from there and made her way up to move to Pescadero, California here back in 2016 for her to kind of learn more about agriculture and practicing it. For myself, I was interested in agriculture from a pretty young age. A lot of my kind of family on both sides are involved in agriculture in some capacity, mostly in like nursery on my dad's side and more like corn, soy on my mom's side, and a few other things mixed in here and there. But I kind of grew up being interested in it. Actually, was kind of most interested in doing dairy when I was younger, but I kind of switched over time to being more into vegetables. I went to UC Davis and I there later on went in and was an apprentice at High Ranch, which is a farm over here in Pescadero, where actually Cristóbal and Veronica and I all met for Cristóbal and I in 2015 when I was there, and then Veronica came the next year. And that's how we all met from there. Kind of started our business several years later after all having experience in working at different farms prior to that.
Yeah. So what finally made you take that step to make the decision to start your own operation?
Yeah, well, in 2018, when we started our operation, we were actually all managing different farms in the area, all managing different farms within like a pretty small, 5-mile radius, give or take, or even less than that in this area. The farm I was managing, we got there was a request basically at some point during the season, I think during the wintertime, for a local bakery that's down in the Santa Cruz area, which is a bit of a way south of us, if we could grow some winter squash for them. And the farm I was on, we had really no more space on the farm. We were kind of maxed out in terms of just acreage and availability of water. And so Veronica and I, who at the time we were dating, we got married later on in 2019, but at the time we were dating, we're kind of chatting and saying, why don't we just lease a little bit of bakery elsewhere just to fulfill this one thing for this one bakery? And Cristóbal, who was our friend, we kind of chatting with, and we were like, oh yeah, this sounds like a fun project to do together. And that first year, I was planning out in I think January, February of 2018. And we ended up kind of over the course of the spring hearing a few more local restaurants and stuff like that wanted us to grow some things for them. So into growing some potatoes, some popcorn that year, and some dry beans as well. But it was very small. It was kind of a side project that we were doing on a small acre and a half, give or take, production was all. Really just a sort of our almost hobby weekend farm, honestly, while we were managing other farms. And that first year went really well. We all really enjoyed working together in that way. And progressively each year after that, we kind of took a much deeper step into the pool, I guess, if that makes sense, in terms of going all in, of us all working full time on our own farm. So all three of us are co-managing it all full time. For us, that step-by-step process was, I think, a good way for us to do it based on kind of where we were in our own life and how we felt like we could easily get into having our own farm business without having it be too daunting at first, of still having jobs working at other farms in the meantime. I was still doing other jobs in the meantime. I think in terms of once we did that and kind of grew from there, we saw that a proof of concept that this was working well for us, and we were growing well and enjoying what we were doing. We were able to kind of really, really grow from there. And I think the one other aspect of it too that I think was interesting is because it was all part-time, very part-time that we were doing that first year, it was really forced us to focus on how can we be efficient in a lot of different aspects of our farm, especially in the marketing aspect, where I think a lot of times you get into a new farm and you're like, kind of, I have to do a farmer's market model because it's hard to get your foot in the door to a lot of businesses. But that aspect of us being like, hey, we don't have time to go to a farmer's market because this is such a small side project, really, I think, allowed us to focus on building out the idea of what does it look like if we're really focusing on just trying to do direct sales to different businesses throughout kind of our region. And so it was a good learning process where it kind of forced us into a model in some respects that we now kind of carry on today.
And how hard was it for you to acquire land to grow on? You said you're on the same land that Cristóbal had grown on before, which is a much bigger parcel of land, right? You're just on a chunk of it. So was it having established relationships that helped you get a land base, or what was that like?
Sort of. I mean, it was, our first year, we were on a different ranch. We were leasing it. And then our 2019, we moved our operation to this ranch. It was based on an existing relationship that we had. We actually subleased the land that we're on now. Subleased actually from Kyrax where we used to work. So there definitely was an important component of having that established relationship, which was very, beneficial for us kind of getting our foot in the door. I think in terms of land in our area, in our region, because we're not that far from the Bay Area, and Pescadero is a very beautiful community. It's right along the coast. There's a lot of pressure in our region, especially in the last 10, 15 years of having it be more expensive because a lot of the pricing on land is not really based on agricultural pricing. It's based predominantly off of kind of vacation home pricing, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so there's a lot of land in our area that's owned by folks who aren't involved in agriculture and often don't lease out that land. Or if they do lease it, usually the challenge is having the tenure to be able to, that you can invest in the land and also in the infrastructure on the land to really have it be like a long-term home. So we still have some challenges with that aspect of it. We've kind of been looking at land potentially to buy in our area over the years, which has been just challenging because the price of things in our area. That's still something we're considering doing, but we really love the ranch right now, and also would like to figure out a way to continue being here for the rest of our farming careers at least. So we're hoping to make that work, but there's always a little bit of insecurity with land just because it's when you don't own it yourself, it's some challenges as far as kind of having a place where you can fully invest in. And I think for a lot of young farmers getting into it, I often hear the term like land access is an issue. And I think that's generally true in the sense that it is tough to just kind of get your foot in the door to find land access. But I think the more challenging aspect of land access is land tenure, meaning that like when you have a piece of land, you have the tenure to be able to confidently invest in that property and that you're going to be able to continue being there for the future. Because if you don't have that, then it's tough to make investments, especially if you're doing a diversified operation where you do need a good amount of infrastructure invested into the property. It's important as well. And so I think from our end, that's really of what we're trying to figure out is how can we kind of have a site, and hopefully that's here at this site. That's kind of our space that we'll have tenure for the rest of our farming careers and, hopefully beyond that. And I think that's a challenge in our area is particularly pronounced. I think it's, probably resonates with a lot of folks who are listening to this as well in different parts of the country. But that tenure piece seems to be a missing element from the conversation from what I've noticed in terms of just general land access issues.
Are there infrastructure investments that you three would like to make that you have paused on because of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. The ranch that we're on right now, it is a ranch that was a historic dairy ranch from the 1870s was when most of it was built up. And actually what's neat is a lot of the buildings are historic from that time period. And so we have a lot of really cool buildings that were built very well way back then that we've been able to utilize to different extents. It's a pretty neat setup in that sense. It's really built for dairy, so there are some differences in terms of what would be ideally designed for like a commercial operation, but to have barn space and storage space on that is awesome. We have invested a lot into fixing up those buildings to make it more functional for us, along with a lot for just other kind of infrastructure things that you just need to kind of run a farm. I think the one difference I would say is in terms of those investments, because there's been a bit of insecurity from like a longer term perspective, we probably would have invested in them differently if it was more where we knew this was going to be our home for like 30 years. So we made investments to kind of get by, but I think how you make investments to get by is different than what it looks like if you're trying to make investments for something that you're going to be using for the next couple decades.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. There's with every infrastructure solution, whether it's say like a wash station, there's different degrees of permanence that you can and expense that you can implement on a farm, and you can make do with many of them, but certainly they might be something you need to rebuild every 10 years, there's a very different approach you can take when it's going to be around.
Yeah.
You had mentioned your area is really beautiful, and I looked at your website a lot, and you also describe on your website, your farm's name actually is derived from, in part, the unique climate you're in. Can you describe a little bit about the place where you farm? Because it sounds really unique and beautiful.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start off with our name and kind of how we got that from there. So Brisa is, in Spanish, it means breeze, but it's a word in our area, kind of colloquially, people use to describe kind of like this mist-like fog that kind of comes in off the coast where we are. And it ends up kind of blanketing a lot of the fields, especially in the mornings, and then kind of dissipating by about 10 a.m., especially in the spring and summer. And so Brisa, we thought was kind of a special name to call it, just because it's that particular fog that comes in is so unique to this area, to this coastline. And when we actually originally created our name, we had the toughest time figuring out a name to start with. But we actually had a longer name. It was called Brisa Ranch. And De Año was referring to of Año Nuevo, because we're right next door to Año Nuevo State Park. It's kind of like a coastline along the coast in kind of the southern end of San Mateo County. And kind of a part of the county, basically, the whole coastline is, but especially on the southern end. And Año Nuevo State Park is a really beautiful state park that pretty much entirely it surrounds our farm for the most part. And from where we are, we're in this beautiful section of the coast on one side. We have the Santa Cruz Mountains go up above us to the north. We're in a pretty rural stretch as well, where we're about a 35-minute drive to the nearest kind of decent-sized town, Half Bay, which I think is Half Bay is maybe 12,000, 13,000 people. And then to the south, another 35 minutes, give or take, to Santa Cruz, which is a bigger town. You have 35, 40 minutes depending on where you're trying to go there. So it's a beautiful place to farm. The climate's very unique as well, because it is a lot of moisture and a lot of that fog that comes off the coast. But you do have a lot of microclimates that also have some of that, which makes it possible to grow some of the leafy greens, for example. But you also do have good heat in certain pockets of the area as well. So we can grow a wide range of things also, like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant that you typically wouldn't associate with a really cold coastal climate. We're in a particular banana belt microclimate, for lack of better words, kind of what folks around here call it, where we're in a section where the geography of the coast is such that south of a certain point, which is a Pigeon Point Lighthouse, it's kind of a point with a lighthouse on it nearby us, we tend to have a much warmer climate compared to the other parts of the coast going up towards Half Bay. So we just get some fog in the mornings, but it doesn't last the whole day, which allows us to do some of those warmer weather crops. So it's pretty unique. For a diversified farm operation, especially a diversified organic operation, it's a pretty phenomenal setting because we have abundant habitat around us that sort of helps with general biodiversity and helps us do a lot of organic practices that we do. And then on top of that, we have this very unique climate that allows us to grow this wide range of 40-ish crops, give or take, a lot of which people don't necessarily associate being grown next to each other. You would often think of growing salad greens, for example, or lettuce in the summertime, while also producing tomatoes as well in the same location. So it's pretty special in that sense.
And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free.
Today's episode of the Growing for Market podcast is brought to you by BCS America. On our farm, we've had our BCS two-wheel tractor for over a decade, and with no belts to slip, its all-gear-driven construction is still going strong. Though we originally got it for rototilling, we kept it even when we went mostly no-till because it can do so many other things around the farm. From snow blowing to making raised beds with a rotary plow to chipping wood, it can do just about anything you might need on a farm with the right attachment. Need to shred a cover crop? A BCS flail mower will make quick work of even the most vigorous cover crop and chop it up so it breaks down quickly. Want to stir in compost or amendments without inverting soil layers? A power harrow turns your BCS into a precise tilthing machine with depth control so you don't mix deeper than you want to. With so many attachments to choose from, it truly is the Swiss Army knife of farm implements. It's why, instead of saying two-wheel tractor, so many people just say BCS. Visit bcsamerica.com to find sale pricing, build your custom BCS package, find your nearest dealer, and more. I am so excited to welcome Bootstrap Farmer as a sponsor of the podcast. I've known them for a dozen years, and if anyone tells you nothing is made in the USA anymore, well, they're headquartered and warehoused in Paris, Texas. They make their own all-metal, all-inclusive greenhouse frames of steel made in the USA and fabricated in Texas, and their heavy-duty, reusable propagation and microgreens trays are Midwest-made. With a complete range of supplies, they have just about everything for propagation and growing, including heat mats, ground cover, frost blankets, silage tarps, irrigation, and trellising. Want to color code your seed starting flats? They've got heavy-duty trays that will last for years in a full range of colors, great for keeping farm seedlings separate from retail or just for fun. And they have an experienced team of growers to support everything they sell. If you've heard of the NRCS High Tunnel Initiative providing grants for hoop houses, but have been put off by the paperwork, Bootstrap Farmer has a guide that will walk you through the application process so you can get your hoop house funded this winter. For all that and more, check out Bootstrap Farmer at bootstrapfarmer.com. There's a lot of talk these days about the value of certification. With the growing distrust of labels and customers who are more savvy than ever, farmers need better options to showcase their commitment to truly sustainable growing practices. Certified Naturally Grown is a peer-review certification focused on the highest ideals of the organic movement. They keep costs low and paperwork to a minimum, so you can keep focused on farming. CNG's peer-to-peer approach encourages knowledge exchange and strengthens regional networks. See why farmers throughout North America are choosing Certified Naturally Grown and apply today at naturallygrown.org.
And now back to the show. And then I assume that it's mild winters too, correct? So are you able to provide food year round to your markets?
Mm-hmm. We do. We definitely grow a lot less the winter time. So this winter, I think we're growing about 5 acres only. So out of about 30 acres total, just doing about 5 or so. The rest of our fields, we cover crop in the winter time. And we do grow some brassicas in particular and lettuces in the winter time. So like a salad mix, head lettuce, spinach. We do a lot of cabbage, some kale, some fennel, some broccoli, particularly it's like a broccoli chico variety. And it does allow us to do those different types of things. Most winters, it grows pretty well. There's not many issues. This past winter, we had an El Nino winter, so it was a little intense. So we ended up not having great success with the winter crops. But on I'd say 9 out of 10 years, the weather is pretty cooperative to do, those crops. You can't get too far outside of that kind of range of crops, but it's pretty climate for those.
What happened in the El Nino winter that made it more challenging? What does that do for you guys?
Yeah, and so for us, for El Nino, the funny thing about California, I'm speaking, for a lot of folks who may be listening for other parts of the country aren't familiar with our weather patterns, but we really don't get rain between about May 15th, typically up until I'd say like October 1st. Typically October 1st is the earliest. Every now and then it's a little earlier, but I have like a good window when you should expect pretty much no rain. We'll get like fogs that come in with a little bit of precipitation from that, but that's centimeters of precipitation or millimeters. And so pretty much all of our rainfall is during other times of the year, pretty much typically in October through maybe the first week of May or so. And in a normal year, we get pretty decent rains in different kind of sporadic points, but we tend to have dry spells in each winter where we have enough of a dry period to maybe get into the ground and plant some things, for example. This past winter, though, we just had a lot more rain than normal, kind of due to a weather pattern that tends to come about every quarter century, which was accurate with this one. The last time we had an El Nino year was 25 years ago. When I was a kid back in like 90, we were for a couple of years consistently from like 96 to 97, I think, finishing in like that end of winter of 98, if I recall. And it tends to be just really heavy rainfall. It's more of a tropical pattern. So while most of our weather tends to come from north to south, El Nino is kind of more tropical, coming from south to north. And we just got way more rain than normal. I don't remember the exact inches total last year, but it was in a ballpark of like 70-ish or so, which for us is a lot.
That is a lot. Yeah. Especially if it's in half the year.
Exactly. Yeah. So we got a really big rain I remember September 17th of 2022, which was really unusual to get something big that early. And it just really kept on raining all throughout the spring, kind of going into really like late May, which for us is unusual. We even had actually decent sized rain in June as well. And so one of the challenges for us was just that much rain on a lot of those crops just doesn't do that well. It just is too much water for it. And the grounds that we had cover cropped didn't have any flooding issues. The water drained really well. And like you didn't really see any issues in those fields that were cover cropped. But in the areas where we did have row crops in, so we just had have beds of cabbage or kale, for example, it just got very, very muddy to the point where it was like you couldn't walk in it. It was almost not soupy, but there was a lot of water. Especially because some of the storms were just so big, a lot of water at once. They were pretty excessive. And then in the meantime, those storms also brought hurricane level winds. So we had 95 mile per hour winds, I think twice. It ruined our greenhouse, pretty much wrecked the greenhouse. It was strong. So our greenhouse we had to rebuild. And then additionally, another challenge as well is we have a creek that runs through our property, which is great because it's a consistent water source, but it flooded to the point where it didn't get to our fields, which was good, but it flooded other parts of the property, which was kind of tough. So washed out a bridge that actually blocked off us getting to our houses as well. So it was a challenging winter. So it definitely, these patterns are cyclical and we can predict them to, not predict them, but we can expect them to a certain degree. I think how climate change factors into the intensity of them is hard to say. Maybe it's more intense, but it's also the weather patterns like that or El Niño patterns happen so rarely. It's about once every quarter century. We don't have necessarily the records to really understand, how those systems work. But when they do come, they're heavy and they're pretty intense.
Yeah. So I'm just a little ways north of you in Oregon, and we had similar weather patterns. I wasn't sure. I know there's some shifts as you go north-south with El Nino, but I do remember we too normally get a few dry spells in the winter where we can maybe not till or anything, but go out and weed or something. And there was nothing. There were no breaks. It was really intense. It was
no, there was definitely no breaks. Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think we got as much rain.
Yeah. No, there's a point in February, I remember, because usually early February is pretty dry and we have a good window. And around like February 10th, we were like, I think we're going to finally have a break. And then we had this massive storm the next day that just or the next week that made it. Yeah. At that point, it was like, no, there's no chance. anytime for the rest of the winter or spring.
Well, in the magazine and also on the podcast, we've had a lot of talk about winter growing, and a lot of the conversation out there is about temperature and low temperatures, right? And heating greenhouses. And I do think that in more temperate winter climates like Oregon or California, there's this assumption that we can grow year round, and we can, but we have this whole other set of challenges, like you were saying with the wind. I mean, we've had greenhouses blow down because the ground was so saturated and then there was wind. It was like the anchors just lifted out. And that's certainly not an issue in Maine in the winter when your ground is frozen solid for 4 months, right? So it's a useful part of the bigger conversation around knowing your place, right? Any success in farming comes down to really understanding where you are. I love hearing you talk about, too, the microclimates even in your valley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our region it's a lot of unique ones. Yeah.
Speaking of place, you market directly to customers and businesses in Northern California and the Bay Area, which I'm just going to tell you as a person who lives on the West Coast, but not in California. I have this idea of the Bay Area being just this like giant, complicated, very populous, very expensive place. And I like, in some ways, I think about that as a farmer and I think, oh my gosh, there's so many people you could sell food to. But it also seems like, oh, it could be so hard to connect with people. I'm so curious how that's been for you and why you chose to direct market rather than to go into wholesale or a bigger supply chain, which is very common for California farms, right? Like much of the country is eating food grown in California. So what has that been like? Like, how do you connect with people? How do you build those relationships? What does your marketing look like?
So marketing in the Bay Area definitely has its challenges and has its opportunities as well. When we entered this space, there's two markets that most farmers sell into. So if you're looking at more of the larger and tend to be conventional farms, and it tends to be in our area, a lot of older farmers who that's kind of been their market, it's shipping stuff down south to the really large ag centers around Watsonville and Salinas, probably more Salinas of the two, which is for folks who are kind of familiar, it's kind of one of the larger kind of ag cities within California. We have so much large scale agriculture, not as much in our particular area. We're a pretty rural section of the coast that's not very developed with anything, including agriculture, relative to some other areas. But when you get to like Salinas, for example, it's just miles and miles and miles of kind of larger scale farms. So that attendant model where you're shipping things like Brussels sprouts or artichokes down to Salinas and saying those would end up going all over the country, all over the world in very large quantities. That model we've been seeing was kind of dying and just doing poorly over time, which is true in a lot of larger wholesale systems. The other market for a lot of other farms that tended to be the smaller farms and the organic farms was going up to area farmers markets. In particular, like getting into new farmers markets, doing some CSA programs as well, but I'd say farmers markets were usually the majority. And the challenge with Bay Area farmers markets, because there are so many farms throughout California, is they're very saturated. There's only so many really good markets within the Bay Area, and there's a lot of other markets that just aren't quite worth the time, to be completely honest. And being able to get into one of the good ones is usually you've had to have been there already for the last 20 years. It's a lot of farmers who maybe were started back in 2000, 2005, that kind of had their foot in the door early on. and the kind of growth of the farmers market model that are kind of our grandfather into those markets. As a new farm business, getting into them, into like a good market is challenging. On top of it, there's also, once you are in one, it takes a little while to kind of develop your clientele. And the other challenge with farmers markets is just, as I'm sure you listeners know, is they're very labor intensive in the sense that you need, a lot of folks to go to actually go, basically be at the markets themselves. There are some challenges for us as well, with labor issues, because we're in a pretty small town that has limited housing. It makes it a bit more challenging. And so from our perspective, we were thinking, how can we kind of find a middle ground where we're taking advantage of this large population center in the Bay Area, and also kind of looking at other parts of Northern California, including like Sonoma County and Sacramento area and stuff like that. And from us, we wanted to kind of focus on how can we go directly to different businesses, not going to a distributor, but trying to sell it ourselves. So that's been our focus, has been going directly to like grocery stores, some restaurants, but restaurants are, I'd say, a relatively small proportion of our sales. A lot of institutional buyers, so a lot of hospitals, universities. We work a lot with school districts now. There's been kind of a new growth in being able for schools being able to purchase from farms, and so we've been really focusing on that as well. Also working with food banks, working with some corporate kitchens for different companies. So like we sell to like the corporate kitchen for like Yap's corporate offices, for example. So that's been a focus as well, has just been how can we really take advantage of the fact that we have this large population that's in the Bay Area. And realistically, a lot of the people who live in the Bay Area, farmers markets are great. A lot of people are just not going to shop that way. And so if you're trying to kind of get as much local food and local organic food onto the plates of folks who are eating throughout kind of Northern California, farmers market model is great, but it only goes so far. As does the CSA model, you really have to work more with the businesses where kind of meet people where they shop already. In terms of our approach for that, it's really been based on relationship building predominantly with the different buyers we work with, which I think has been kind of like a slow process, but it's a process that's been very rewarding, because I think it's allowed us to grow our business kind of incrementally, where we know we're growing each year based on what crops we have demand for. And it's kind of allowed our process to be very deliberate in terms of choosing what we grow and how we want to kind of grow each season.
So it sounds like with your marketing strategy in the very saturated Bay Area is been to look for that open niche, which I love the idea of. Like a lot of what we do with Growing for Market is thinking about direct to consumer sales. So CSA, farmers market. But I love that what you're doing is thinking about that next layer of where, quite frankly, how a lot of people get their food. Not everybody is up for the extra work of going to farmers market or signing up for a CSA. But if there's fresh local food available at their local grocery store, yeah, of course, I'll buy it. So I love that you've seen that as your open opportunity in a pretty saturated market. And the schools, so is that a specific initiative that some of the area schools are working on to try to get more local food? What does that look like?
Yes, that is a newer program in the state of California. And I know there's some other states that have similar programs to have school districts buy directly from farms. And it's funny because I remember talking to a farmer from Minnesota. This is like back in 2019, 2020, somewhere around there, keep or take. And they were telling me about how their biggest customer was a school district, was I think it was like the Minneapolis school district, one of the districts there. And I was like, well, get into town. That's crazy that's where one of your big markets are. And fast forward, really this past year, or I guess the past 2 years, but more this year, there's been a lot more ability for schools to market or to source directly from local farms. The way it's kind of played out, I think, has been a little bit uneven, because some schools have been able to apply for the grants to be able to get the funding to do these programs and buy for local farms. So it's funny because when you're trying to find buyers among different school districts, it's, you go to one district and they're like, oh, perfect, we want to source from local farms, we have the ability to do so. And another district is like, I don't think that's possible. I have never even heard of that. So there seems to be a little bit of uneven information. I'm hoping in years to come, either it becomes more ubiquitous within all school districts, because I think it's a really neat way for one is for us to get, healthy food and onto the plates of a bunch of students and kids. I think two is it's kind of a fun market where you're able to grow for something that obviously it's great to grow for anybody, like a high-end grocery store, for example, but I think it's a little bit more special in some respects to have it be something that everybody's pretty much eating across the board. And I think it's been kind of our intention to is work with a different range of markets, where we are working with some expensive grocery stores, but we're also working with some grocery stores that wouldn't be considered as expensive. but maybe are small enough to where they'll source from local farms directly. So we found that sometimes if you focus too much on where I've seen a lot of younger farmers do, which is like, I'm going to find like the Michelin star restaurants, for example, and really focus on those because it seemed like they'll buy local produce. That is a market you can find, but I think it's easy to forget there's a lot of other good markets that will buy your produce, even if it's not one that you would maybe expect, even if the price points are lower. And maybe there's also crops that you can grow at that price point that they would love to source from you at. So there's definitely quite a few markets we grow with that we grow for like grocery stores and even some local grocery store chains where people hear that we sell to them and they're kind of surprised because it's not what they would typically associate with a local farm going directly to a grocery store.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious what types of vegetables you sell to a school district. I assume this is for their kitchens, for the prepared foods that they're offering to the students throughout the day. What are the kids eating?
Yeah, good question. So we found based on how it's played out so far, and I think this may change over the years, but so far we found that it's a lot of food that can be utilized as almost like a snack food. And based on the nature of how the grants are written, which is you're actually calculating like the cost per individual student's like unit of food, it tends to be snack foods that are easy to calculate. So for example, we do a lot of apples with the school districts, which is one of our big crops. We also do a lot of sweet peppers, particularly lunchbox peppers. We do like a lunchbox mix that Johnny Seeds provides. That it's a really nice one. We've done other things like cherry tomatoes. A lot of our bush beans, we do like a blend of, we call it the Mardi Gras mix of like purple, yellow, and green bush beans. And we do some other things as well. There's one sort of food hub we sell into, a spork food hub, that sells to a lot of different school districts within Northern California kind of region. And with them, we do a lot of, especially salad mix that's used for kind of like school lunch salads, and additionally some spinach, some potatoes, a few other things in lesser quantities. Those are kind of the main crops. One of the complications that we found though is a lot of the schools don't have the ability to process their own foods. So they have to really get things that are like basically ready to go easily, where you can cook them without having to like do a lot of prep work. So like butternut squash, for example, is typically not something they would buy. I think there's exceptions if you're selling to like a food hub that then does their own processing and then sells the squash afterwards, but most schools can't receive like just a box of butternut squash.
So they don't actually have full kitchens. They have a space where they're sorting food and distributing it, but they don't necessarily have knives and ovens and things.
Yes, they have ovens. It varies school to school and district to district. They have some of the things, but typically like it's stuff that doesn't require a lot of processing. Maybe it's something where you like, here's a olive oil on it and put it in the oven, and that's sufficient. Like I think they've done that kind of thing with like our bush beans, for example. But the really heavily processed things tend to be more challenging. Like the potatoes that we send, those are, I think, if I'm not mistaken, pre-cut at a different facility, and then there's the school district after they're pre-cut.
Okay. How cool, though, to think that your vegetables are going to kids. It's great. It's awesome. And maybe a lot of kids who may or may not have vegetables at home. So that's awesome.
No, and I think we've got a lot of good feedback from a lot of students and teachers and stuff like that, where a lot of the kids actually get more excited. I think one, learning that this came from a farm that's too far from their school, and then two, just gotten good responses about kids enjoying vegetables, which is pretty special to hear. So, yeah.
I remember when we were doing our CSA, sometimes parents would talk about hiding vegetables in the food. And I always thought, I get it. They're trying to get them to eat vegetables. But I also thought, I don't want your kids to think vegetables are a chore. They are yummy.
They are, definitely.
So the markets you're selling into, it sounds like, do affect your planting plans, the types of crops that you might be planting, and in what quantities. What do you feel like are some things that maybe you've specialized in, or that you really love to grow or do particularly well at your site? It sounds like actually people wanting particular crops is sort of how this whole journey started for you. So do you feel like you have some special niches there?
Yeah, it's a mix of things. So some crops that I'd say are, more just kind of like your not generic, but sort of generic crops for like a small diversified farm to grow. So, we do a lot of like tomatoes, for example. We do have some niches within that, range. For example, like we do a lot of dry farmed early girl tomatoes, and there's a number of different buyers who specifically they want to work with us because they love those tomatoes. So like they'll just regularly order really huge quantities of those. If there's a grocery store I'm thinking of, for example, it really focuses on those because it's something that you're not necessarily going to see in like a Safeway or a large grocery chain. Definitely not of like that quality or dry food. And there are some other niches that are kind of more specific to a certain buyer really wanting one item. So it may be that one buyer says like, hey, we want this particular type of winter squash or this particular type of potato. That really varies buyer to buyer, and it's often built off of relationships of working with a buyer for multiple years. So what I found is usually if it's a new buyer, they're going to kind of order like the first year or a little bit of just miscellaneous everything just to kind of see what we have. And then usually by the second year, they kind of tell us like, hey, we really would like to have more of your delicata, for example, or we really like to have more of your early girls. And then in turn, we can kind of build a crop plan for next year with that. We also have some really unique niches, I think, as well, in terms of a few crops that we grow as well. So like, for example, Cristóbal, as I mentioned, he grew up in Oaxaca and his family's been farming there for pretty much as far as back as they can go. So we used to end up growing sort of an experiment, a lot of really unique winter squash varieties and a few other pepper varieties and bean varieties kind of from that region. And particularly the winter squash varieties, the names of them are Chiricota is a really pretty winter squash that kind of looks like a big watermelon in its shape and has just a very unique flavor and unique texture. India is another really good one. Castilla is kind of like your classic winter squash that you see in a lot of Latin American markets. We do a couple of other ones that name like Huiche and Pipián, these are kind of like going into the depths of like winter squash varieties that you're never going to see typically in most United States grocery stores. But for a lot of folks who, maybe immigrate to the U.S. from like Oaxaca or immigrate to the U.S. from other parts of Mexico or Central America, are products that there's a lot of desire for and they're just hard to find in the United States. So with a lot of those items, we grew them really beginning out of just an interest of like, more than anything, Cristóbal was just like, I want to see how these grow here, because it's a special crop to me. And eventually we ended up finding a lot of Latin American kind of grocery stores and grocery chains that have ended up becoming really important buyers for those. So we do, for a lot of those sort of more unique heirloom, I guess kind of Latin American or Oaxacan winter squash varieties, we do pretty large quantities of those in particular. I think actually those are by far our largest quantities in terms of winter squash that we grow. And it's one of our bigger crops. Like Chiricota, the one I mentioned, that's kind of the watermelon shaped one. There actually have been just, if anybody's, listening and interested in trying a different winter squash variety, it's just very fun. Those are really cool squash. They're super productive. I've seen like individual plants the size of like probably half the size of a basketball court. That's like how big they branch out to.
What?
Yeah, they're crazy. They also vine up. I've seen them growing in trees about 15 feet tall. They're a really, really cool winter squash, and they're super, super productive. It's a neat variety that, I think most people who are trying to think of like, okay, I'm starting a small farm. What crop should I grow? What markets am I going to grow to? I don't think people would necessarily think like, I'm going to grow a unique heirloom variety of winter squash that 99% of all the people in the United States have probably never heard of before, and sell them to like a Latin American grocery chain throughout the area. So I think those kind of unique crops are worth kind of taking the risk on and finding your niche within them. And sometimes it's not about finding the market, but it's actually like growing the crops so you can build a market for that crop, which is what it's been for this. Because the grocery stores that we work with couldn't find these crops, these particular winter squash before. And so they now work with us each year specifically because they know we're kind of the only ones that really grow them, at least in sort of this kind of scale that they would need. So I think that's kind of a neat example of, it's not just finding a niche, it's kind of creating niches too.
Yeah. I want to come and taste all these different squashes. I love winter squash. So the idea of some new different ones to chase sounds wonderful.
That's
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the kind of the philosophy behind how you guys operate your farm. Like many farms, on your website, you share your farm's core values, which is a common thing, especially around growing practices. Yours is a succinct statement, so I'd like to actually read it for our audience so they can hear what you've got on there, and then we can talk about it. So there's 3 points. In the spirit of justice, we want to ensure that all communities can access the food we work so hard to grow. With reverence and respect for our land, we know that we as farmers have a tremendous responsibility to promote biodiversity and to restore the ecological processes that sustain us. And finally, recognizing the challenge of mending a broken food system, we commit to joining forces with other farmers and eaters to restore trust in food and farming. These are some great values. Can you share with us some of the specific ways you all are working towards them and what they look like in practice?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I'll start with the third one first, which is kind of joining forces with farmers and eaters to restore trust in food and farming, I guess is how we phrased it. A lot of our work that we've been focusing on, especially in the last year, has been trying to create different systems of irrigation within our region and trying to make our agricultural region of kind of like the San Mateo County coast, all the parts of the Santa Cruz County coast, more viable for kind of small farms, new farmers getting into it, for basically just having a more robust kind of farm food system within this region that's connected in turn to markets throughout the Bay Area and other parts of Northern California. And a lot of their work has been kind of looking at examples of food hubs in particular that have been built up within other parts of the state or other parts of the country, and kind of talking about with other farmers in our region, can we replicate something like that and create a food hub that would allow us to sell to a lot of the different businesses, different institutions throughout the Bay Area that would, in a lot of respects, just one, create a market for the farm businesses within our region. And also, I think in turn, also allow new farm businesses to kind of start up essentially in the region, which is something we would like to see, because there's just a lot fewer people who are getting into farming these days. And I think that's I think one of our big reasons for doing this among many, but one of them is just we don't see a lot of younger farmers get into farming. And then among even the farmers who do get into farming and are really talented, often they don't stick around in farming because they don't see a viable route of, like, let's say, creating their own farm business, for example. And so I think having a good market that you can kind of sell into is something that would be important. So we've already been doing some irrigation work with buying from other farms, or more, at this point, it's been more aggregating deliveries from other farms. But we have been involved in kind of conversations with Tomcat Ranch, which is a nonprofit farming organization in our area, our local RCD, and Kitchen Table Advisors, which is a kind of a agricultural consulting firm that works with a lot of different farms. And Veronica from our team has been kind of leading this, but the whole point of it's been like trying to talk to different farmers in our region and build up like kind of this food hub through sort of a democratic process of talking to different farmers and seeing what is needed. This upcoming year, we're really excited because Veronica is going to be focusing a lot more on that process in particular. She's going to be kind of stepping back from some of the day-to-day processes on our farm and going to be more focusing on building this larger food hub, which is going to be really exciting. Our farm was trying to sort of spearhead the beginning of it as sort of an interim step to get it really started, with the idea that maybe eventually it can kind of be self-sustaining as potentially like a cooperative among the different farms who are part of it. So it's been kind of a new exciting piece to what we're doing right now and kind of what we're getting into next year. We also have found like some really cool contract grants. We're working with some large food banks to supply them with CSA style boxes. And it would be specifically with the idea that we're sourcing from not just our farm, but other farms in the region as well. And so that's going to be kind of the first like large scale buyer that this project is going to be working on, and then kind of hoping this kind of grows from there. So I think from that aspect of it, we see this sort of collaborative piece with our farmers and other farms to be an important aspect of like fixing the food system, for starters on the side of the farmer, on the side of kind of agriculture, of creating this new market. And then two is also creating more pathways for getting produce that's grown locally into like these, local markets in the Bay Area and Northern California. And I think that aspect of it is important in that sense, in terms of kind of what I was referring to earlier, making sure that we are growing produce that's accessible to pretty much a wide swath of people. I think one thing that I will say, I think that we've tried to make sure we aren't doing is, I think that there's a lot of really great models of having a farm business that works for farms, but I think it's often the wide swath of the population is not necessarily who is always getting access to that food. It tends to be, often folks might be a little bit more wealthier or might have like the time to be able to go shop at farmers markets on a consistent basis, which is not always realistic for everybody. And so I think not that those models are important and not that they're not an important way of getting food out to everybody, but we're trying to figure out of how can we just have more food in general in our local region coming from the local farms directly. And so I think this kind of collaborative piece would be important to that. I think our business at building up to this point in the way we have through our marketing channels has been doing that, but I think now we want to kind of grow beyond that and have it be more of like a regional approach to that, a regional collaborative approach to that. And then in terms of, I guess the other point, which I'll just reread, I just for the listeners out of context, which was with reverence to respect for our land, we know that we as farmers have a tremendous responsibility to promote biodiversity and restore the ecological processes that sustain us. I think from our perspective, we have a commitment, I think, to growing organically, but I think more importantly, it's really to building up the soil that we grow on, so that we're improving the soil that we're growing on each year. So we're certified organic by CCUF. We also are certified regenerative organic by the Real Organic Project. And what I would like to see in the future, in terms of just a general approach, is I think organic has been watered down to a certain degree because it's not really about what its original spirit was, which was improving soil and improving the biodiversity in your soil. And in turn, it's become more of like, let's just list off the things you can't use in your farm operation. And so I think from our perspective, it's more about how are you promoting biodiversity, how are you promoting soil practices that, kind of in turn multiply that. So it's using practices like cover cropping, composting, doing crop rotations. That's something that we all do those practices of. So all of our lands are cover cropped, at least once per year. And there's a lot of different things that we try and grow and we try and learn as we do to make these systems, more efficient and more effective in terms of promoting biodiversity. I think it's important that we do figure out a way as a food system to differentiate those different practices, though, because I think we're right now at this point where we kind of have this division of conventional versus organic, but we're kind of missing the nuance within the organic models. And I think until we kind of I don't know how to do this, but until we can kind of market, but also just define what those different models are, I think we're lacking some of the nuance of working with different, like food systems working with different farms, for example. I think it's important to really hone down on what practices do we want to see and promote those accordingly.
Wow. Yeah. You guys are really, you're really doing it. I love to hear that these values are also taking you outside of your farm, and which is obviously we are, as local farmers, the whole point is to be working with our community, but we can do that strictly through our customer base and business. But it sounds like you are taking it to the next level of thinking, how do we partner with other farms, with food banks, and then, of course, thinking about the long-term soil health as well for future generations.
Oh, no, I appreciate you saying that. No, I think from our perspective, we do this because we love farming and love being in the field, but I think we realize that we've been able to make it work as a farm in the sense that we found models that work for us, but we see that it's not necessarily something that can just be super easily replicated to such an extent that it can really change, have everybody doing it within the correct context of the food system as it is. So we kind of see that it's important to change the food system more in general in terms of trying to find more collaborative ways of marketing among farms and more collaborative ways of working with different outlets throughout wherever it is that you're selling to. Because I think if you don't, you end up having a lot of different small farms that have become a bit balkanized in the way that they're operating, the way they're selling, which I think is definitely, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think in terms of making a food system where you can easily have a new farmer, start up a new farm and have confidence that they're going to have success, it should be that there's outlets for them to be able to sell into. And it should be that there's a nature of different businesses in the Bay Area, for example, in our region that should be able to work with those farms. And I think until we have that fostering of new farmers in particular, we're not really in a good space within the food system or within the agricultural system.
Totally. And it's wild to think about the idea of a market being saturated or feeling saturated to new farmers when food is literally the one thing every single person consumes.
Yeah. No,
right?
It's definitely crazy.
Yeah. So when you think about it that way, it's the one variable that's true for everyone. It's not a variable. It's we all eat, and yet how do we help shape a market where that process is really healthy for the people eating the food, for the people growing the food, for the whole community? That's the big work. That's the big work of the farming community. It's certainly not something we're going to finish in one generation, but obviously each generation can keep making contributions to that. Speaking of the longer term, we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but I am curious for your farm, what do you see as being some longer term challenges that you're looking ahead, trying to figure out as far as your farm's viability, your place in the community, you as people, whatever that might be?
Yeah, it's a good question. We kind of joke sometimes that we've dealt with a lot of crazy things in the first, I guess, this is the end of our sixth season of our business, that at this point we feel a little bit bulletproof, just because we've dealt with crazy things like the flooding we had last winter that was pretty wild, and also dealt with we had a CZ wildfire that hit our farm in 2020 as well.
Oh, 2020.
Yeah. So 2020 was, I mean, the pandemic was obviously a extreme challenge for a lot of farms during that year. And then for us in that same year, we had, in August of that year, had a wildfire hit our farm. That was a huge challenge. And so we, ended up spending about a week straight fighting off a wildfire in the middle of like our normal harvest season. And then afterwards, we lost some of our stuff on our farm, but we were able to protect, most of it. And then after that, had to kind of figure out with no electricity for I don't know, 5-6 weeks, how to continue running our farm. And we had no water because we used so much of our water fighting the fire. It just, there's a lot of crazy things basically that year. So it was, I think living through some other challenges that we all went through as a society in 2020 as well, some other miscellaneous things here and there. And then the flooding last year, I think we feel like we can figure out ways to make it through these different challenges. I think that we feel confident about, in the sense that sometimes those challenges end up becoming blessings in the long term, because they do give you the confidence to kind of grow and move beyond what you're doing, because I think you recognize that if you could survive that, you could survive other things. So I think from that end, there are definitely real challenges. The land tenure aspect is something that we discussed earlier. That definitely is a challenge in terms of just being able to make sure that the piece of land that you're on, you can be there in the long term. Another challenge for us in particular is access to housing. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because, as I mentioned a bit earlier, in recent years, there's been a lot of folks from the Bay Area who have been buying vacation homes in our town of Pescadero. Our town is like 600 people for reference. And of the houses that are in Pescadero, I would say like probably more than half of them are now owned by people who don't actually live in them, who have them as vacation homes or something like that. And so we really have a pretty extreme housing crisis that in particular makes it tough for anybody who's working on a farm to be able to have housing. So a lot of the farms in our region tend to have housing on site. They're able to offer from just like building historically a long time ago. Building new housing though is really challenging due to county regulations. So trying to like find folks to work with our farm is easy in the sense that I think we have like a lot of people who we know and really like working with and stuff like that. But our inability to provide housing for them has made it to where a lot of folks can't work with us full time. So because their housing is dependent often on them working another farm as their full-time job. So that's been a real challenge for us is how do we figure out how to deal with housing for all of our employees. That's been kind of a limiting factor for growth. And then besides that, I think, there's other things that are challenging for everybody. Weather's obviously, every year different, and climate change is making that a little bit crazier too. Market prices and inflation has obviously been a challenge in a lot of farms this year. And I know talking to a lot of our farmers in our region, it seems like a lot of people have really struggled this year in particular with just dealing with the economic conditions that we have right now, with inflation of a lot of their supplies and equipment and stuff like that being so expensive. And produce prices haven't necessarily kept up with that. Yeah, I think beyond that though, as I mentioned, I think we really would like to see a more robust agricultural system in general. And I think like the stuff that I mentioned previously that we're working on, I think is kind of where we're hoping to go with that. But we see having a more robust system as a whole being kind of a better way for us to be able to deal with these challenges as a whole. Our region being strong is going to make it easier on us as a farm. And I think from us in terms of how do we hedge these challenges, I think that's the way that we kind of approached dealing with it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to view our whole society, is if there's more security for everyone, then each individual household, each individual business has more security too.
Yes.
I feel like that's a no-brainer, but not everybody's on board with that idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so then on the flip side, our audience is market farmers. I think people are going to relate to a lot of what you shared and get some great ideas from you. But I'm always curious to ask people if there's like one tip or trick that's just been like the best thing you've done, or one of the best things. Hopefully you have a lot of best things, something for your farm.
That's a hard question because I think there's a couple of different things you can think of. I mean, I'll speak, I guess, a couple of different aspects of this. I think one is when you're trying to find a market for yourself as a farm, go outside the box. Don't necessarily just stick to the same models that a lot of folks do. When you do try and work with different businesses, relationships are really important. Organizations are really important. You really have to be like providing the same level of customer service to your businesses you work with that like a massive international produce distribution chain will provide in order to be competitive. And while that sounds daunting, it's not at the end of the day, because really that's just like one sales rep for that company who's managing it. And you can do the same thing, but you do have to be really organized in order to do that, in order to be able to sell to those markets. There are a lot of different softwares that are out there. We actually utilize our own systems that we've kind of created for the most part in terms of just built out of different like Google Sheets and stuff like that, and using QuickBooks predominantly. But I would say if you're going to try and dive more into that kind of direct to business type of market, just you really have to be crossing your I's or what has the expression, dotting your I's and crossing your T's in order to make sure you have all the details ironed out to be able to do that consistently. I think beyond that, trying to find also a good array of crops for you, both based on building out your market and also based on what you works well for you to grow within your climate and within your systems is really important too. Finding a good seed rep is also really important. Just different seed reps you can work with to be able to talk to them about crop varieties. It's something I've noticed a lot of farmers kind of getting into it often don't have. And I think trying those relationships are really important when you kind of can talk to a seed rep and have them really know this is what you should grow based on kind of what you're looking for. This will do well in your climate. I think that's become something that's become apparent to us is just how that stuff works. And then I would just say the other thing too is just keep on growing during the process, and like how your farm is going to look. If you're someone trying to create a new farm business, how that's going to look in the first year is going to look very different than how it will in year 5 and beyond. So whatever you're doing, do it with the expectation that you're going to continue learning. You may end up changing what crops you're growing. You may end up changing how you're marketing. It may just evolve over time, but don't be afraid of that evolution and change.
Excellent. Wise words. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Let's see. I mean, I would just say for folks who are, your show, I listened to it a long time ago when I still listen to it sometimes, but when I was first getting into farming, I think this type of show of listening to different farmers is really important just to get context of how they operate and how they kind of go through their thought process of what they do and how they grow. It's important just insight to get. And I will say that for the folks who are listening to the show with the idea of creating their own farm business or managing a farm, it's a risk that is worth taking. And even though it's very daunting, and even though it's very challenging to just see how difficult and broken our agricultural system is, there are ways of making it work. It is a lot of work, and it's more work than most jobs are going to be by far. But there's a lot of beauty in what it is that you're doing. And I'll say this for myself, there's a lot of pride I feel in the work that I do that I probably wouldn't feel if I did something else. And to me, that's worth a lot. I feel like I've been able to be my own person, and I think there's nothing richer than that in terms of being able to just farm in the way that I want to. And I would just say that for folks who are kind of trying to have a dream of doing something, it obviously takes a lot of prep work. It takes a lot of preparation of figuring out how to make it work. But yeah, it's worth diving into as long as you have a good plan to do it, and as long as you have the kind of background knowledge of how to do it. It's worth trying to make work. And I think more often than not, it will. And I think for the rest of us in the farming system, it's more about fostering a better system to make that leap of faith a little bit easier on young farmers.
Okay, there's your pep talk, everybody. If you are on the fence or trying to figure it out, we just got a great pep talk. I feel excited about 2024 now. In fact, I got some ideas from this talk, so there might be some changes on our farm next year. Okay, how can people connect with you or Brisa Ranch to connect further? You have a website, Instagram. We'll put those in the show notes.
We have a website. I forgot this in the show notes, but yeah, brisaranch.com. We're on Instagram and Facebook and that kind of thing too. And if anybody's interested in reaching out, please feel free to. You can find our contact information, I guess, in the show notes or on our website as well. We appreciate you having us here, and yeah, appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much, Cole. I hope you have a great winter, and maybe we'll talk again.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thanks so much, Katie. Talk to you later.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can now try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine subscription for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never get billed. Even the most basic subscription gets you a year of the magazine, plus 150 back issues from the last 15 years. Digital subscriptions start at just $30 per year. So head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers for farmers in Growing for Market magazine.